Good morning, good afternoon, depending on what part of the country you're calling in from today. We're very happy to have you here. My name is David Matei, and I am Strategic Advisor in the Fraud and AML Group at Datos Insights, or formerly known as iTakeover Group. I am thrilled to be with you today moderating this webinar. And the title of the webinar today is 360-degree fraud prevention in the customer lifecycle. So what we're going to be talking about today is the intricacies of fraud prevention strategies across all the different phases of the customer journey. A couple housekeeping items before we get too far into the call today. One, you'll notice there are a few slides that we'll be presenting to you today. We'll be making copies of those slides available after the presentation, as well as a recorded link to this so that you can review the webinar again at a later point in time if you want. Second item is we'll be leaving time at the end of the webinar in order to handle questions from the audience. So we encourage you to please use the question dialogue in your GoToWebinar tool in order to be able to submit questions to us for Armin, Blair, and I to answer at the end. And so as we begin now, I'd introduce our two panelists. First is Blair. Blair, can you introduce yourself, please?
Hey everybody, I'm Blair Cohen. I'm the founder and president here at Authentic ID. Authentic ID is a next generation identity verification company. Pleased to be here with all of you today. Thank you, David.
Thank you, Blair. Appreciate it. Armin.
Thanks, David, and thank you for everyone for joining us. I'm Armin Najarian. I'm the Chief Marketing Officer with SIFT. SIFT is, hard to believe now, 12 years old. We've, one of the OGs in the fraud prevention space, and we're still chugging along. So great to be here, David.
Wonderful. Glad to have you on the webinar as well. So thank you very much. So I want to kind of set the scene initially in terms of the conversation that we're going to be having today. And so if we can go to slide 3 on the webinar deck, one of the things that we used to do from a fraud standpoint is we'd always look at the financial transaction, the third item to the right, or from the left as you go through this. And what we would always do is kind of take a look to try to identify, is this transaction that I'm needed to do, whether it be a payment or a transfer of funds or whatever the case may be, was it fraudulent or not? Should I approve or decline it? And what we have found is that there's been this big push, of course, into the digital channel. Take a look at e-commerce growth rates over the past several years. Take a look at what the pandemic did for not only e-commerce buying, but also for online and mobile and digital banking. And so what we've been finding is that the fraudsters have started to perform different levels of attacks much earlier in the overall process. So when you're looking at the financial transaction and the payments, it's really looking at trying to protect or find the fraudster as they're walking around the house. And what we've started to learn now over the years is that that's not good enough anymore. You really need to be able to go to the front door and protect the front door. And I'm talking about when you're opening up a new account, when you're looking at an account login, and other ways along those lines. And what we're finding from the fraudsters is that they're becoming very adept and effective at finding ways of being able to get through the front door. Now, as much as what we put our defenses up front to protect that front door and keep the fraudsters out, it's never going to be 100% perfect. And so you need to have that balance of protecting the front door as well as monitoring activity when people are walking around the house. And so you'll notice here on the slide that there are all different types of attack vectors that fraudsters use and various kinds of defenses that we have in place in order to be able to go off and mitigate that. So that kind of really leads us to our very first question here. Blair, I want to direct this to you. I can't believe it. We're sitting here December 13th. We're a couple weeks away from the end of the year. But as you take a look at as we close out the end of the year 2023, looking back, what have you seen in terms of fraud scams that have been prevalent among your customers?
Oh goodness, David, it's for us. We service a very specific part of the market. We service large enterprises, whether they be telecommunications companies or large financial services, or the government sector. And the government sector frauds have been pretty well publicized. I won't repeat everything that's been happening there, but I think what we've seen the most in a dramatic increase in this year is generative AI, the use of generative AI. We're seeing more synthetic faces than we've ever seen before that are being expertly adhered to an identity document. So we're seeing a tremendous increase in that attack vector.
Yeah, generative AI, you can't open up any kind of publication these days without seeing something mentioned about that. And while people talk about the opportunity for it to be used for good potentially, but fraudsters are figuring it out much faster, of course, how to using it for fraud. So it's kind of one of those battles that we're going to continue to have to fight for quite a while.
Yeah, and they're getting much craftier than ever before. It used to be that these synthetic faces would just be presented to the device, to the camera, but they've realized that with penetration attack detection certified liveness detectors, we stop that all day long. You can't really attack us in that vector. So they've gotten much more creative, and they've decided to inject and bypass the camera sensor and inject images into the back end with the varying degrees of sophistication, which is also something that we can defend against. But they are getting craftier.
It's always a game of whack-a-mole. We do something to stop them, and they find ways to get around it and get a little more clever, unfortunately. It's kind of the nature of the game. So,
job security.
I was told that years ago. Getting your hands on data, and fraud data especially, is particularly tough. In my prior life, when I was managing fraud for a global payment processor, thousands of FIs, a couple 100,000 merchants, one of the things that I always get asked by fraud executives is, how does my fraud compare to my peers? So Armin, I see that SIFT has recently introduced a fraud industry benchmarking resource. And SIFT, with the wealth of companies that you have, you've got a lot of data at your hands. So can you speak to the trends that you're seeing across the industry and regions associated with fraud?
Absolutely. Yeah. Thanks, David. So just a little context about Fiber, which thanks for teeing it up. So Fiber, Fraud Industry Benchmarking Resource. We've heard just so many questions repeatedly when we get in front of customers of how am I comparing against my peers? How am I comparing against the industry? What does my performance look like for my region or versus another region? And we came to the realization that we're sitting on a ton of data, more than 1 trillion transactions scored per year, and kind of just open sourcing that. It just felt like the right thing to do. So Fiber is just that. And the insights that I'll speak to are pulled directly from Fiber, which you can access on SIFT.com at any time, SIFT.com/Fiber. And so what we're looking at here specifically is a sector-specific cut of the data for online travel and lodging, and across geographies. So this is worldwide. This is the data set for SIFT online travel and lodging customers, as depicted by the solid line. And as you can see, the payment attack rate for that sector is above the general population of customers that SIFT serves. And so it's clearly like, a higher risk profile with this population. So a few reasons that we've kind of uncovered of what's driving this like disproportionate reality and risk reality. One is, by definition, like the travel and lodging platforms, if you think about it, just generally attract more fraudsters. These are generally large scale, big brand awareness platforms that have a lot of consumer interactions and offer many different payment types. So it's a kind of a wider attack surface for fraud actors to have fun with and engage with. That's reason number one. Reason number two, why we believe there's such a delta here of this sector versus the general population, is that by definition, like these are aggregation platforms, right? They're two-sided marketplaces bringing in buyers and sellers, and so there's less familiarity perhaps that the platform has with the various audiences that are interacting with the platform, and it just kind of that step removed arm's length relationship does provide, in some cases, just more opportunity, right, for nefarious activities. And then third is just by nature of how these platforms were developed over time. Many of these aggregation platforms were kind of homegrown, over the years and became big entities. And so there's perhaps a lack of standardization in how these platforms are constructed and some of the controls that are in place. And so when we factor those variables into the equation, I think it in part at least explains why we're seeing just such disproportionately more risk with this particular traveling and lodging sector versus the general population.
Yeah. So it sounds like that you have the ability to actually select different kinds of industries and different types of geographies around the world through the Fiber tool that you have available online at your website.
Yeah. So this view is looking at the entire population through the lens of different regions. And so now all in the top row of payment fraud attack rate, that's all industries, all sectors that are within our network, and then divided by or viewed by through the lens of EMEA, as well as US and Canada. And you can kind of see generally like the payment attack rate, which is what we're measuring here, generally consistent with the general population. Like the solid line is, more or less, aligned with the dashed line. Where we see the big variance is down below is the chargeback rate and the very clear disparity by region. And I think there's a couple of explanations that I could offer for that. And so in EMEA, why is there such a lower chargeback rate, relative to the general population? I think there's just more controls in EMEA. Like you have different regional standardizations and policy, like strong customer authentication. You have different types of payment authentication levers, like 3D Secure, that is certainly driving, it's a different consumer experience, but there's a different set of controls involved there. In contrast, if you look at the Americas in the lower right-hand corner for chargeback, performing worse relative to the general population. We're seeing perhaps in the Americas more friendly fraud, more first-party fraud, which is driving some of these chargeback disparities. So it's there's a very clear set of regional nuances that that Fiber has uncovered for us.
Yeah, and you take a look at chargeback data. Unfortunately, that's a set of information that's really hard to get your hands on these days, especially being able to see it from a regional difference perspective across different geographies of the world. So the fact that you can get to that through your tool has got to be pretty welcoming and helpful asset to have for clients and non-clients alike who are able to go to your website with this.
Yeah, I'd say the chargeback data is probably the number one most in-demand set of insights that are being consumed right now through Fiber. So absolutely, David, you've got it right.
Yeah, absolutely. The chargeback are a big issue just because of the resource strain that they unfortunately inflict upon both issuers and merchants alike.
Indeed.
Yep. So synthetic identities has been around for quite a long time. Unfortunately, it's just been over the past several years where it's been getting a lot more attention within the press, but people have known that it's been around for quite a while. I was speaking to a fraud executive who recently switched jobs, and he landed at a new bank. And one of the things he wanted to do when he came to the new bank was actually do an assessment of all the existing bank accounts to get a sense of how many synthetic identities could potentially be on their books. And when they did the analysis, they came up and said that 15% of the accounts on the book could potentially be related to a synthetic identity. Now, when you're looking at an average cost of when one of these accounts go bad of $10,000, and some people think that's a little bit on the low end, that, in some cases, especially if you got a crafty fraudster and they start maxing it out, it could be upwards of $50,000 to $100,000. Regardless of what the number is, 10,000 or 100,000, when you got up to 15% of your accounts potentially being fraudulent, that's a huge risk on the books that you need to be careful of and to be able to go off and manage against. And so Blair, question to you. How are organizations differentiating between legitimate versus synthetic identities at the time when they're actually creating new accounts?
This is a very, very difficult problem to solve. I don't think there's any one silver bullet there that's going to stop a synthetic. From our perspective, what we do is authenticate legitimately issued, government-issued identity documents. In most states in the U.S. anyway, we have the Real ID Act. And it's exceedingly hard for a synthetic identity to go get a genuine ID issued to them. You have to have a history with the IRS. That social security number needs to match. You have to have a birth certificate that's oftentimes verified with the system of record, the register in that county where you're born. And then you have to have a government issued identity document. So while synthetics, it's very, very easy for somebody to create this Frankenstein monster of a synthetic identity because of the Fair Credit Reporting Act and the way that the credit bureaus need to act. So it's super easy to create a synthetic, but very, very difficult for you to have a legitimate government issued ID issued to you. So that's what we've seen that's been highly effective at stopping the synthetics from inflicting this kind of damage. Those are just amazing numbers. 15% of the population could potentially be synthetic. And I see that, 6% of the time, that's a $250,000 loss. That's terrifying.
Absolutely, yes, because when you start looking at the way that the fraudsters use these synthetic identities in order to cultivate an account over time, they're very patient. They're willing to spend months or years and then maxing out their credit lines, whether it be through a credit card or through a loan or whatever the case may be. And then, unfortunately, when they decide it's time, they'll hit it all, max it all out, and then disappear. And that's a problem, no doubt.
Patience is the key.
Yeah, and they're very patient with these accounts. Yeah, and so having them on your books is, again, it's a significant financial liability and a risk exposure that you need to be very careful about.
And look at, the other stat on this slide, 53% of synthetic customers have been offered a credit card. I mean, this is, again, we obviously need to have better controls from the credit card issuers. 53%, my goodness.
Yeah, because when they're looking like a valid account, you're trying to market to your own customers, and when you're actually marketing to the fraudster, you got a problem. And I'm sure a lot of the people on the line here have gone through and unfortunately experienced those kind of issues as well.
Well, as a marketer myself, like, that resonates really well with me. The adage of I'm wasting half of my marketing dollars. I don't know which half. This is a new reality that my peers are going to have to pay very close attention to. Certainly.
No doubt, no doubt. Which is why it's better to keep these things out of the ecosystem from the get-go, rather than letting them in and then trying to figure out how to weed them out later on. Because there are pretty expensive costs associated with this. So Armin, question for you. Some of the research that we've done at Datos, we've seen where account takeover fraud is a constant concern from our fraud executives. You've been to our fraud crime forum that we have in September every year, and we poll executives who show up for that, and we ask them about what are your top 3 concerns from a fraud standpoint. And we've been doing this for several years now. And ATO fraud is in the top 3. It may be number 2 one year, number 3 another year, et cetera, but it's always one of the top 3 concerns we hear from financial executives on the fraud side. And so the other aspect of ATO fraud is that the attack vectors themselves, they just keep on increasing over time. Fraudsters are very clever about finding new ways to be able to perpetuate this type of fraud. So what are some of the more common tactics that you see among your SIFT clients in terms of how fraudsters are trying to take over user accounts? And that's the first part of the question. The second part is, how do we stop it?
Yeah. Massive problem. You can see the data here. So this data is from the 3rd quarter of this year, as compared to the same quarter 1 year ago. And the numbers speak for themselves. On the left is just overall attacks, ATO specific attacks across our own data set. And then on the right, even more alarming, among the fintech community itself, more than double that, rate. It's just alarming that account compromise, account takeover fraud is a problem, right? So we're kind of staring the problem in the face. This is not new information, but this really helps to dimensionalize it. And so we're seeing some, certainly Blair brought it up earlier, and you brought it up earlier as well, David, innovation. Like there's a vibrant fraud actor economy with tools and processes and automations and organizational structures and funding and fraud as a service, right? And so there's absolutely more ways, more opportunities for what I'd call cottage industry fraud actors to organize fraud actors to engage and try to compromise an account. And that might be an ATO that takes place with a valid user account that is a transactional account. It might be an ATO that takes place for a loyalty account with their stored value. And so what's being depicted here is just one attack chain that I think there's a couple things to highlight. One is this kind of fraud as a service economy that I referenced earlier, where anyone, right? Anyone who has any interest in perpetrating some form of financial fraud or ATO fraud can go out and actually purchase tools on the open market, on the secondary market, to help propagate a one-time password fraud attack. And there's a very, I'd say a very automated sequencing process that will take place where the messages can be configured, where a otherwise unwitting consumer can be spoofed into providing information for that OTP, and the fraud actor can successfully get into an account and do their work. And so, what you're seeing here is very typical. We're seeing this type of attack, this type of trend, time over time with increasing velocity across the SIFT network. It's very alarming. So to answer your question, like how is it addressed? Real-time detection, right? That's one of the underlying must-haves for anyone who's playing in the digital economy, right? To properly assess risk. So preaching to the choir probably, but having the right controls in place, having the right partnerships with the right data set, the right systems in place to make those decisions in real time is really the number one variable in the equation, David.
Yeah, and we take a look at the number of data breaches that continue to occur year over year over year, and the amount of PII data that gets exposed, the amount of compromised passwords that get exposed,
Yep.
and the fact that unfortunately consumers still continue to reuse passwords across multiple websites. It just exacerbates this particular problem. And the fraud as a service, we used to find that that was basically all in the dark web. It was in the underground. But more of these websites are now on the surface that you can get to it through any kind of normal browser. You don't need to have any kind of special tools to go off and find these kind of fraud as a service type of attack vectors. They're pretty easy to get out there these days. And even more scary is, go out onto YouTube, and the fraudsters are brazen. I mean, there are YouTube videos that you can actually watch in terms of how to fill in the blank. ATO being one of them, and it just mind-boggling.
Yeah, it's kind of alarming. Like there's very little attempt to conceal the methods anymore. It's kind of all out in the open. And to your point, anyone with any interest in doing something nefarious can experiment and access the tools and education and content themselves. And kind of what you're seeing here is another example of that. Atlantis or Atlantis X, as it's been known in the general market. So credential stuffing, like automated credential stuffing attack types, like these tools are available to put into the hands of, again, organized fraud actors or individuals to perpetrate a brute force attack against any digital property. And so like these tools are available. They're the cost is coming down. That's the other reality is the availability of the tools is there, and then where there is a fee structure involved, like there's the law of supply and demand is certainly taking shape where the cost is lowering. So this particular attack type has been, serious. We've certainly seen a lot of this within our network, and we're certainly helping to stop a lot of this type of fraud using just real-time detection of the presence of bots and credential stuffing to know what's authentic and what's not in real time and make the right decision to shut something down. So I predict this will be something we see a lot more of in 2024 with variations of this, nuances associated with this type of, bought in the open market, credential stuffing type of attack.
There's two issues with that. One, to the point that you just made, is one, the tools are cheap, so pretty in the hands or within reach of just about anybody out there. And the other item is you can conduct attacks at scale. with this. I mean, we're not talking about onesie twosies. We're talking about hundreds, thousands, and tens of thousands of accounts that can be attacked pretty quickly through these kind of tools.
That's right. And so the other thing to point out is, yes, the attacks can happen quickly. Speed is currency right now, right?
Yeah.
So we have, on the good side, like we're trying to shut down these attacks as quickly as we can, but all it takes is 30 seconds, right, to be successful. And so speed to market, speed to react, that time is compressing more and more.
No doubt, no doubt. So we want to move
We've
on
all seen how amazing the large language models are as well. And just one more fraud tool to mention, we've heard of Chat GPT. There's also Fraud GPT that can act at super scale with an incredible amount of sophistication. So beware.
Yeah, it's not just bad English that you can use to detect. These tools allow you to get beyond bad English pretty quickly in order to make it look pretty realistic.
Right.
Absolutely. So the next thing we want to do is a polling question that we have. So if we can get the question pulled up and present it to our audience. So what methods is your business currently using to fight fraud throughout the customer lifecycle? And this is a multi-select. So of the options listed here, which one of these tools are you currently using? And we're going to give everyone a little bit of time in order to respond to this survey. And we're going to be taking a look at the answers in order to kind of figure out which of these tools are popularly being used out there right now among people. These are pretty broad set of tools, but they're all very effective in their own way at being able to often mitigate these different types of fraud. All right, real-time transaction monitoring. Armin, that should be music to your ears. That's what you've been preaching here, so congratulations. Risk scoring, and I'm sure that kind of goes along with real-time transaction monitoring as well, and ID verification. So all are really important tools out there. Bringing up the list there, behavioral analysis and biometric authentication. I think that those are going to continue to increase in popularity over the years, just because it takes a multi-layered approach to go off and fight this. Armin and Blair, what strikes you about these results?
Blair, you want to jump in first?
Yeah, I'll jump in first. I think I'm super pleased to see that 50% of you are using ID verification technology. It is very beneficial at stopping a wide variety of different fraud vectors. Would love to see more people embracing biometric authentication. As we all know, the account takeovers and the synthetic identities are a problem. But the reality is that first-party fraud is almost 33%. It's almost a third of all the fraud that exists out there. That's where Blair calls up the company at the end of the month and says, I didn't do it. If you think about biometric authentication, it kind of eliminates that, right? You're going to have a really hard time saying, I didn't do it. When I have your face, your date and timestamp, your geolocation, that's going to be a much more difficult fraud to perpetrate and pull off in the future. So we'd love to see that number up, but right on everything else.
Yeah, when I look at this, David and Blair, I'd say these are all critical ingredients for success, right, in any fraud fighting arsenal. And there is no one silver bullet, but I would also say that each of these ingredients must be part of the mix. And I agree. I'd say that biometric authentication will continue to increase and showing up in the stack with more frequency as a signal to help drive the very best real-time decisions. But no shock, right, with what we're seeing here. And I'm sure this would resonate with any fraud fighter that we speak to in the marketplace.
Absolutely. I think it also the number of solutions that are above 50%, I think it also kind of highlights the fact that you got to have that multi-pronged strategy. There's no one tool that's going to do it all.
Indeed.
Absolutely. So Blair, question for you. At the Datos Fraud Forum that we had this past September, there was a fraud executive who got up there and said, I'm giving up. I am no longer going to fight fraud. I'm not going to be able to win the battle. And you know what? Throw the hands up in the air. He goes, I'm going to change though. what I'm going to do now is actually start the authentication fight, where I look at identity proofing and authentication of users. He goes, that is a battle that I think I can win. And if I can win the authentication battle, I think that will also translate into lower losses for my institution. It was a pretty bold comment to be made from a fraud executive saying, I'm not going to fight fraud anymore, and I'm going to shift my tactics to the user authentication. So when it comes down to things like identity proofing and authentication and being able to get the upper hand on those, what are you seeing in terms of the latest advances in identity proofing technology? And second part, how do they contribute to being able to mitigate fraud and lower fraud losses?
Well, as we talked about extensively already, the fraudsters are crafty. They are well funded. They collaborate with one another. So putting up just one barrier, you don't stand a chance. We do a darn good job with just doing document authentication and face matching. But what we're seeing is the rise of the integrated identity platform. So you ingest the signals from the document authentication, from the biometric matching, from the liveness detection to make sure that Armin was really alive and present and taking a picture of his real face and not a picture that we found of him from the many speeches that he does every year out on the web. So that is highly successful, but you need to add in other layers, things like email validation, things like phone number validation, behavioral analysis is really nice. We're seeing this pressure from our customers to reduce the friction, but they still want to stop the fraud. So I'd love to see, again, I've talked about it a lot, this biometric authentication continue to proliferate, because to me, it's the perfect marriage of fraud prevention and user experience, which is what all of our customers want. They want to be able, when you click on that link, they want you to convert. And being able to do it as simply as opening up your phone with a biometric is really kind of cool to me.
And David, I love that that anecdote you shared, like, from the conference. And my commentary on that anecdote is, one way to think about fraud. Fraud is a symptom of, right? Weaker, either the massive data breaches that have kind of plagued the industry for 20 years, and insufficient authentication controls, right? And so I think this is really a commentary on what we're seeing as a better alignment between fraud and security. More so now than we saw even a year ago, 2 years ago, and 5 years ago. And I think that kind of quote essentially leads us there, that the better we can as an industry provide richer authentication with more certainty, knowing that, right, much of the fraud emanates from perhaps data that's available in the open market. We can be more successful downstream with catching fraud, lowering fraud loss, and driving that better consumer experience.
Absolutely. And if you take a look at the individual blocks on this slide, they're not necessarily individual tools, but a lot of capability that gets built up into an overall solution that then gets brought to the market. And it just kind of shows the difficulty that you have in terms of the number of things that you need to take into consideration when you're looking at identity. And so it also kind of speaks to the power of some of the tools that are available out there in order to be able to go off and do some very detailed types of checks and analysis in order to be able to make sure, as Blair said before, from the standpoint of a government issued document, and how do you know it's a real document versus a fake? And some of the fakes coming in from Asia are awfully darn good these days. And so there's a lot of analysis that has to be done, not just on the photo itself and liveness detection, but also on the document, and making sure that the document itself is a valid, originally government issued one, and not something that was been counterfeited over the course of the years. So I love this slide just because of the fact that it really just kind of highlights just the amount of interrogations that you need to be doing of the video, the pictures, and the documents in order to be able to go off and manage all that. Awful lot. So one of the things that we talked about before was the fact that we've got this trend where things are going online, digital online banking and opening up accounts there, going online in order to be able to do and fill out an application, whether it be for credit, for a home loan, even being able to go off and open up account with an e-commerce merchant. So there's a lot, of course, going on there today. And one of the things that we find in our research at Datos is that there are many people who come together these days in order to be able to figure out what does that process flow look like for the user. What kind of steps do we need to take the user through opening up a new account online or getting into an existing account. And we're finding that you have people from compliance, from the fraud group, from the online account group, from the line of business, and others who all have to come together in order to be able to figure out, okay, what is this optimal user flow and the overall process looks like. And I always tell people that if you really want to see a very spirited discussion, get somebody from the line of business and from the fraud department and say, design a secure and easy to use online process. And you get the fraud folks there who are saying, security, we got to put controls in place. And the line of business people saying, oh, let them in, they'll be fine. And so, it's got to be that balance. And so, Armin, when you're talking about balance, how can organizations strike that right balance between having a secure process, but also a user experience that's not going to turn people off?
Yeah, one of the jokes I like to share is that you can bring fraud down to zero by putting a cybersecurity executive in charge of fraud, right? I guarantee you'll have zero fraud loss, right? And so this is the theme we talk about as an industry all the time, right? It's the two sides of the coin. It's balancing fraud and security, and it all comes down to understanding the identity behind the transaction.
Yeah.
So that you can make the best decisions in the moment. So yes, real-time decisioning is important, assuming you know the who behind the what. And so with that, and that's what drives ultimately a best consumer experience. And in understanding that, having the tools in place, confidence in the data, to have the ability to assert in the moment that David is in fact who he asserts he is. And therefore, I am confidently going to not step him up. I'm confidently going to allow this transaction, even though it's a new device that I've never seen before. I know enough about the persona called David Matei to know that this is an authentic transaction, and I want to deliver a great user experience. And I think that's something that every stakeholder in the enterprise can get behind, provided that the tools and the data and the cross-functional alignment is in place to drive to those decisioning outcomes. Again, what I'm sharing here is not new in the industry, but I believe it's happening better now than ever before. We're just seeing a lot better alignment across these functional stakeholders. To your point, all in the room together. When we go through a sales cycle selling into a new account, we are with increasing frequency seeing more and more stakeholders from a very diverse set of departments all lending their point of view into these very big decisions that directly touch consumer experience, that affect revenue, and that affect profit.
Yeah. And I think you hit on a really good point. A lot of times fraud executives have been, let's figure out who the bad are, who the bad actors are. And sometimes it's a better approach, or maybe not a better, but a complementary approach is, let's identify if they're a good customer, because we're typically got more good customers coming to a website or an online account trying to get in than you do the fraudsters. And so let's fast track the good guys and put some more friction up for the bad guys. And so it's not just let's go find the bad actors. Let's also find some ways of being able to say, yep, this is a good customer. I've seen them before. Let's just get them into and let them go off and do their business.
It's a very important point you're making. And the 4 fraud prevention companies I've worked for over the past 10 years, like more than 95% of all transactions are in fact authentic and good. And so if you start there and say, hey, ultimately, we're not in the fraud business, we're in the revenue optimization business. We want to provide the best experience possible for that 95% plus of transactions, and we want to have the right controls in place to better decision on that 5%. So you're absolutely right, David. This is ultimately a consumer experience discussion that has very big implications on revenue.
Absolutely does.
I'll concur with you though, David. Those are spirited discussions that happen when you trying to strike that balance between fraud and the business. I've been in that room many times.
No doubt, no doubt. And when you take a look at the end of the day, fraud is really a drag on any business. Doesn't really matter what kind of business you are. Fraud has a really negative impact. It comes down to the potentially lost revenue from turning away a customer. It's the financial loss that you have to write off because of the fraud that you are liable for. Customer trust and satisfaction comes into play associated with these. Armin, we kind of talked about before, but wasted marketing dollars. I attract people to come to my account, my site, and do business with them, and then I tell them no because I think they're fraudulent. All the acquisition costs that you now have thrown out the window. So this question is for both of you all. Do you have examples of how your solutions are able to help mitigate these fraud losses for customers?
David, or Blair, please jump in.
Yeah, okay. I'd be happy to. So we, as I mentioned earlier, we do a lot of work with the telecommunications industry, and not surprisingly, these Apple iPhones and the latest, Android phones are pretty expensive, and they're worth an awful lot of money on the secondary market, virtually the same as what you'd pay for it with an unlocked phone. So they are attacked greatly. We find more than 2,000 or roughly 2,000 fake IDs just in U.S. telecommunications companies every single day.
Wow.
Every single day throughout the course of the year. And that amounts to a pretty substantial savings. Christine, well, I think it's $3.4 billion that we saved just the telecommunications companies in fraud losses in the past year alone. So there's a pretty concrete example of tremendous success.
Yeah, those are staggering numbers. Absolutely. Armin.
Yeah, from our perspective, we're seeing a very robust business in the quick service, the QSR space, quick service restaurant, mobility specifically, mobile consumer experiences in the QSR space. And the attack type that we're frequently seeing is what I'd call policy abuse. And so, for example, as a new consumer, making a purchase transaction through a mobile experience with a QSR, there might be an offer. There might be a, buy X, get Y type of experience, or first-time user experience. And if left unchecked, that can be abused like quite liberally, both on a friendly fraud kind of, your average consumer basis and in an organized basis. And there's absolute risk there for the business operator to allow that policy abuse to kind of go, unchecked. And so we have very specifically seen that across multiple customers. This is not specific to one customer in the QSR space, but that type of attack comprising at least 10% or more of volume and increasing to the tune of at least millions of dollars saved per month at the individual operator level. So it's the type of fraud that you kind of don't think of around policy abuse. I'll just let a consumer kind of qualify for the same benefit twice. But if you multiply that, and it's more than twice because there's orchestrated fraud with thousands of identities, it can add up very quickly, and it can distort the financials of the business. And so it's absolutely one example I like to point to in very recent months.
Mm-hmm. So we're getting towards the end of our webinar here. I have one last question, and then we're going to open it up to some audience questions. And so for our audience, if you do have questions, feel free to throw it into the chat box, and we'll be getting into it right after this one. So last question for Blair and also for Armin. It's the end of the year. We're now thinking about 2024. And so what suggestions, recommendations, best practices do you have that you would share with those on the line today as they are now starting to put together their plans for 2024 and how they're going to protect their organizations?
It's a great question, and as we've kind of illustrated earlier in the polling questions, there isn't one single answer to that problem. I think what we're going to see a lot more, the largest attack vector to me is phishing, and it can do the most damage. I think that we're finally going to see, we've been talking about going passwordless for an awful long time. I think we're finally going to see passwordless happen in 2024, but it's not just going to be passwordless anymore. We now have the ability with some novel technologies to also eliminate the username. So if I eliminate the username and eliminate the password, it's going to, I don't want to use the word eliminate breaches, but it's going to dramatically reduce the number of breaches that occur out there. So I think this is going to be the year of elimination of usernames and passwords.
It would be a welcome thing.
Indeed, yes. I'll add to this, Gen AI and AI has obviously been in the headlines like for the past 14 months. It was easy to dismiss, even a year ago as, perhaps a trend or perhaps something that would take many, many years to manifest. But we're seeing it on the attack side. We talked about on this call, leveraging generative AI and AI science on the attack side to drive attack sophistication. I would say 2024 is going to be the year that on the tool side, you are going to see real examples of AI-driven fraud fighting solutions, both generative AI, and the example I'd give on the Gen AI is, policy setting, right? So using Gen AI to help construct different types of policies depending upon the context of the situation faster, right? Back to the comment I made earlier around, that 2-second advantage of, developing the right rule, the right policy, or the right pivot on the moment. So I think that's a use of Gen AI in the context of fraud prevention, as well as broader, I would say, like unsupervised machine learning to drive decisioning, right? With massive data sets that are only getting bigger, and transaction volumes only growing. I do predict that 2024 will be the year for many, many providers in the industry to really bring that home and make it real, to be able to fight fire with fire effectively.
I couldn't agree more with you. I mean, there's too many people who are still fighting fraud through manual rule writing, and there's just it's too slow, too ineffective, and too many false positives in order to be able to go off and do that effectively. You really need to bring the machine learning technology to bear because the fraudsters are, and if you're trying to fight the flamethrower with your garden hose, you're not going to win.
It's a tough battle to fight.
Oh, great discussions, and I hate to cut it off, but it's time for us to move on to some audience questions that have come in. So the first one is related to synthetic identity fraud. Excuse me. So the question is regarding QSRs, quick service restaurants and retailers. How have they combated this problem as well, or have they? This particular question is coming in from someone who says that they have a lot of fraudulent accounts, and so they're interested in hearing what kind of best practices are there for these industries, specifically QSRs and retailers.
I can offer a point of view, and certainly a big problem. So we're seeing the rise of AI-generated synthetic identities, certainly in the QSR space that I referenced earlier, in part is driving some of that policy abuse attack that I referenced earlier. So it is a big problem. It can be solved, is the good news. And with a lot of the techniques that we've described earlier today, both on the authentication side and the examples that Blair gave, as well as some of the examples I gave. So yes, we're seeing that. Yes, I empathize with the person that asked the question because that specific attack vector is growing like wildfire. And Blair referenced some of that, the data earlier.
And I would say the other problem with the QSR space is that with lower price points, people may not think that, okay, I lost a coupon for a free gift and the free item, whatever the giveaway is, okay, it's gone. But when you talk about the scale with which this can happen, pennies add up, dollars add up very quickly when you're talking about these kind of attacks at scale. So I would suggest that start quantifying the problem, because the more you can quantify the problem for your management, the more attention it gets, and the more dollars are going to get invested in terms of being able to go off and bring controls in place to be able to mitigate that.
Yes.
Another question from the audience, and Armin, I think this is one can go to you. Pardon me, go to you. Does SIFT specifically have controls to combat account takeovers?
So we do have controls to combat account takeovers, and like most players in the industry, like we are looking at the end-to-end digital user journey, starting with account creation, all the way through payment transactions and down to account compromise and account takeover detection. So yes, we do. I'd say it's a use case that we serve quite regularly at scale. Sometimes we go it alone, and sometimes we partner, depending upon the use case. If there's a compliance need, or if there's richer behavioral biometrics that are needed, or some other form of authentication. But absolutely, it's a use case that we see quite a bit, and it's a use case that SIFT can address.
Great. Next question, I'm going to send it to Blair, but I think Armin, there's probably an aspect of this that you can probably jump in and help as well. So Blair, the question from the audience here is, what's more effective, email address verification or phone number verification at the time when opening up and creating a new account?
I would say all three are equally spoofable. All three. Probably phone number being the more difficult to spoof. It's pretty hard to do a SIM swap, but there are all kinds of ways to make that happen. It can be insider collusion. People are very, very good at social engineering via the voice channel. So it's maybe more difficult than an address or an email address, but all three are super spoofable.
Yeah. And I think it goes back to the comment that was made before, is that there's no single tool. You got to have a multi-pronged tool. And sometimes what's best is to go off and deploy multiple of these tools, and then you can assess the performance, because phone number validation could work really well for one company, and maybe email is better for another company, depending on the use case and the scenario that you're going off and try to protect. Armin, what are your thoughts?
Generally agree that historically, spoofing the phone has been more challenging. Like we've seen the rise of these OTP kind of attacks that have provided a little bit of an advantage, right, for the attackers. And on the email side, it's kind of a funny anecdote. It's like, there's the Google dot exploit, right? So you've got a Google email address, and some fraud solutions just weren't detecting the presence of where that dot is, which was a very simple exploit. But even like basic controls on the email side, I think are much more commonly applied right now. But I do agree with Blair. Like the mobile is more difficult to spoof, but there's definitely some advantages now for the fraud actors.
Great, thank you both. Another question: what are the biggest gaps that you see when it comes to identity solution space and also the fraud solution space? Biggest gaps that you see in these type of solutions?
I'll take that first. Armin, please add a little bit more. I think the biggest gap that I see out there, the tools are fantastic, but we're at an extreme disadvantage in that the fraudsters don't have to play by rules. We all have to play by privacy rules. We all have to play by all the different regulations that exist. And we're operating in a silo, whereas the fraudsters have the ability to collaborate with one another and really share what's working and what doesn't work against a specific attack vector. So that's what I would offer. Armin, what would you add?
Similar. I was at a recent industry conference, and it was a panel discussion, and the session moderator did kind of an audience poll, an impromptu audience poll, around like kind of reporting structures. Most of the people in the room were, I'd say, at the more junior level fighting fraud, reporting up to the CFO in many cases, right? And so that kind of reinforced that, okay, if you live within that world, it's going to be just about stopping bad things from happening as best you can and saving the company money. But where I think the big gap is what we've touched upon earlier is rethinking where those boundaries are. It's not just stopping fraud, right? And it's not just about helping to enable revenue, right? It's looking at the end-to-end enterprise risk profile and saying, okay, on the very front end, right? There's security, and there's certainly digital risk that's taking place in the market. And how does that translate and align with your fraud prevention strategy? I don't know if a lot of companies are doing that good enough yet. And I'd say that's a big opportunity for the industry, is to truly align these upstream motions and upstream controls that are still feeling somewhat disconnected from what's happening in the fraud fighting universe. If we can solve that as an industry, or at least just get better at it, I predict we'll all be more successful in our fight.
And I would throw one more thing in there, is that some of this comes down to organizational challenges and issues, because in some organizations, some companies, the online account is managed by one group, fraud is managed by a different group. And this is not okay, you take care of the front door, I'll take care of walking around the house. You need to bring these people together in order to be able to not only look at commonality of data and how it can be used in order to be able to get a better picture of what's going on. We talked about the title of this webinar being the 360-degree view. And I think that you need to bring that data, the data assets that you have, even across organizations, across departments, into a unified whole in order to be able to get a better view of what's happening out there. So, we need to break down some of the walls that sometimes exist inside of organizations. Two more questions that we have, if we can have time. The next one is there a healthy bad actor rate and chargeback rate as baseline metrics, or would that be something that is industry specific?
I'll just add to that. I think it's highly contextual by industry and by geography. I mean, it truly is. And I kind of touched upon chargeback rate and nuances being driven through just realities of a certain sector and the tech stack of that sector, or the the consumer experience in that sector and where the exploitations might be. And so I do believe, David, it is to apply a broad brush, saying, okay, this should be the chargeback rate, broad brushed across every industry and every geography, doesn't do it justice. There is important nuance that you have to pay attention to.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's where a tool like what you have available now, Armin, in terms of the fraud industry benchmarking resource, where you can go out there and actually have some data points that you can kind of compare. And I would never say there is a healthy bad actor rate. If it's above zero, it's unhealthy. But the cost to take it to zero is another issue there. And
yes,
no one has infinite resources in order to be able to drive it to zero. But what you want to do is you make it as hard as you can for the fraudster in order to get them to go away, have them go off and find it an easier software target someplace else other than your company.
You got it.
Last question, and this goes out to both Blair and also Armin, and Blair, we'll start with you. Does Authentic ID and does SIFT have any open source intelligence or OSINT tools or platforms?
For Authentic ID, I'll say no, we do not.
Okay.
Yeah, again, just reinforce fiber as the, our kind of answer to that question. Fiber, again, is the entire data set of SIFT, the entire network of SIFT, the hundreds and hundreds and thousands of customers we serve, the trillion plus transactions we see every year, and taking that data and delivering it to the industry and allowing anyone to come visit and interact with the tool and really understand what's working for your sector or your industry. And so it's that's our answer, David, as far as providing something to the sector, to the space, to our peers to help move the ball forward in our fight against fraud.
Yeah, and I would say open source intelligence is kind of a difficult one, because everyone who offers a solution in the space has got their own consortium of clients and intelligence that they learn and glean from all the transactions they process. And so that's the benefit of going to your preferred vendor and companies like Authentic ID and SIFT in order to be able to leverage just the skills and the data and the resources based on the breadth of clients and transactions that you process for on a regular basis. So we are at the top of the hour, and one last opportunity for Blair and Armin. Any parting thoughts for our audience?
Really enjoyed the discussion. Great questions, and yes, I think it will be very interesting to see if our predictions hold true for next year. So that'll be fun to monitor.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I second that. Thank you, David. Thank you, everybody that joined today. I'm hopeful that my predictions bear fruit next year as well. We'll reconvene this time next year and see how well we did.
Let's do that.
Sounds great. Armin, Blair, again, thank you very much for your time and the information that you shared today. And to the audience and everyone else, have a great holidays. Take care.
Thank you.
You too. Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Bye.